Hello friends, welcome to Houseplant Tips and Tricks. My name is Nick and today I'm going to show you how to make this fun wall-mounted orchid art piece. We're getting crafty today. This series is sponsored by repotme.com. Get all of your indoor gardening supplies delivered to your door from one place. Repotme.com has practically anything you need for your orchids, succulents, and houseplants, including handmade potting mixes, planters, fertilizers, and much more. This project was sort of an envisionment for me in the last couple of months. I'm a really big fan of these wooden slat mounts. I had used these in another project for Houseplant Tips and Tricks with repotme.com last year where I tied ferns, like just a single fern or other epiphytic houseplant, onto these wooden slat mounts with the idea that they would just fit seamlessly on the wall, whether you were just hanging it by itself or you're including it in like a gallery wall. Because of the shape of it being just a square, it would fit much more seamlessly than if you were to mount a plant on a piece of cork bark or something that's going to be much more of an irregular shape. And while I'm obsessed with the single mount ferns, like literally obsessed, I wanted to do something a little bit more creative because these literally are like a frame in my eyes. I wanted to treat it more as such and tie an orchid, just a single small orchid, to here, and then we're gonna use the rest of it as a little bit of an air plant display. I think it works fantastically. In fact, I think if you even wanted to, you could skip the orchid entirely and just place air plants inside here, use this as an air plant frame. Skip the step of having to tie an orchid to it and keep up with watering that orchid. However, I think it's going to give you much more of the spectacle, the aesthetic, when you have a freaking flower growing off your wall. So that's what we're doing today. And obviously this is like a bare bones vision that I have going on. This is the first one that I made and I'm very happy with the way it looks, but it obviously can be expanded upon. You could use some fancier moss inside here, use even more air plants to really fill it out. This is just the beginning, just the base idea, a template for you to work off of to make some really fabulous pieces in your own home. So what are you going to need to make this fabulous little orchid wall mount display? I haven't really figured out what we're gonna call this yet. So of course, you're going to need a wooden slat mount. These are available on repotme.com. I will leave these linked in my description below. And if you click through the link and make any purchases through the links that you click through in the description below, I will get a small commission. So thank you so much in advance. I really appreciate it. And while we're on that topic, if you use code NICK, you'll save 10% on any potting mix that's available on repotme.com. Along with the wooden slat mount, you are also going to need some sphagnum moss. This is going to be our potting medium today. This is also available on repotme.com and will also be linked in my description below. You will need some fishing line. I'm using 30-pound fishing line today, but I would recommend using roughly 15 to 20-pound fishing line. 10-pound or less I find breaks pretty easily, but 30 pounds is a little too thick. So do yourself a favor, if you're buying yourself a fresh roll, 15 to 20 pound is perfect. You'll need some scissors just to cut the fishing line and clean up the sphagnum moss. And of course, you're going to need an orchid. I'm just using a standard orchid that you can get from most grocery stores for little to no money, and some air plants, whatever air plants you can get a hold of, the more the merrier. So you're a little far away. I don't think you're gonna be able to see everything my hand's doing, so I'm gonna bring you closer for this part of the video, and I'm gonna push you back in a little bit so you can go back to seeing my beautiful face, okay? All right, babes, we're gonna try out this angle. Let's hope for the best. So I just removed the air plants from this mount that I already have done, and I just wanna show you that my orchid is not mounted directly in the center. You probably noticed already. The way I'm kind of planning this out is that depending on the way that your orchid would look best, that it would either be mounted in the bottom right or the bottom left of your mount. Really depends on your own aesthetic. Also depends on your orchid. You might notice that this has turned out to be a really great orchid for me to mount because it's got these two beautiful flower spikes. They both have plenty of flower buds on it, which, by the way, hot tip when you're picking out your orchid at the store, make sure it has plenty of buds that have not opened yet, because that means the flowers are going to last longer. If all the flowers are open, while it might look like a more beautiful specimen in the store, it's not going to give you as much joy in the long run. That aside, you can see that these two flower spikes are both on the same side of the orchid, so it was really easy to mount. They're both giving the exact effect that I'm looking for when this is hanging up on the wall, whether you're looking at it from the side or you're looking at it from the front. It's going to look gorgeous, especially with some air plants in there. However, I have this orchid that we're going to be mounting today. And while it is freaking gorgeous, I think we could all agree on that, the flower spikes are on opposite side of the orchid. So this might not be the most viable orchid in most sense. I don't think we would be losing that much if we do have to cut off this flower spike. It only has a couple of flowers on it. And while we appreciate any flower for being a flower, it might just cause more problems than not. And obviously this flower spike over here is taking up most of the energy. So we might remove this one in the back if it doesn't work out, might keep it on, we'll see. But anyway, where I'm going with this is we're going to have to figure out with our orchid, I guess we don't need to do this immediately, but just so you can get a rough idea of how you're going to be laying out your mount. Decide if it's going to look better on the right or on the left. I would push you away from doing the center. While I'm sure you could blow me away with a beautiful project that you do with it planted in the center, I think it's just going to look a little too intentional in my own opinion, and it's going to take away much of the room for the air plants that we are so lovingly going to include in this display. So I'm gonna sit down, pardon me, it's just going to be probably a slight mess for the moment. Hopefully this angle is amazing. So what are we going to do to start out? We are going to get our orchid out of its medium that it's in. Now, if you get an orchid from the grocery store or the plant store or wherever you get your orchids from, and it's already in sphagnum moss, then you are likely good to go. You don't have to worry about this step. Maybe just remove some of the sphagnum moss, but we have our orchid here planted inside this material. Don't really know what to call it. We used to refer to this as brownie material back at the plant store that I worked at. We don't want this. It's not going to do us any favors with our mount here. While it is a fine medium to grow plants in general, we just don't really need it. So you can try to find where it opens up. Usually it has a little spot where it'll kind of open up. I think it's right here. You can see, maybe just kind of playing a guessing game with the camera lens right now. Opens up there. If you can remove it easily, that's perfectly fine. If not, just peel it away piece by piece until you have most of the brownie removed. If it's orchid bark that you're working with, remove the orchid bark. The only thing that you don't really have to worry about this is if, like I said, you already have your plant in some sphagnum moss. The sphagnum moss is going to play as our potting media today. Most often you're going to plant your orchids inside some bark or some of that sphagnum moss inside a container. We're going to be using minimal moss today. The orchid's supposed to be the star of the show, and orchids will grow perfectly fine in minimal medium. The only thing is that we're just going to have to try to remember to water this a little bit more often. But I do find with my own habits that the plants that are mounted up on the wall, I remember to water them way more often than I remember to water anything that is sitting in a pot somewhere obsolete. Alrighty, so we have our pile of brownie material. We have our orchid beautifully removed from it. You can see the roots are looking fantastic. We can go ahead and set our orchid aside for the moment. Just going to get rid of this brownie material, and let's get our wood slat mount going over here. So I do think we're gonna have to remove this. I know it's not the most joyous of occasions having to remove a flower spike, but it's only got like 2 more flowers coming in. Although this one's about to bloom, I don't know. This one's just so much more important. Let's go ahead and carefully remove this. There we go. Sad, but I don't know, I'll appreciate it. I'll hold on to it, so I'll put it in a little vase and just treat it like a cut flower for a couple days until it withers up and dies. Which, by the way, these pruning shears are also from repotme.com and will also be linked in the description below. So I really want my orchid to be kind of like flat up against the wood. And I really like the way that the flower spike is kind of leaning over onto this left side. If I was to put it, or I guess my left side, your right side, I apologize. If I was to put it over on the right side, it would be kind of spilling off, which once again is perfectly fine and actually is completely beautiful. It just kind of defeats my purpose of treating this like a framed piece of art. So I would like to try to keep the contents of the art inside the frame. As always, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Maybe you would prefer it to be coming off the frame like that. To each their own. I will let you figure that out for yourself. But I think it's a good spot for this to sit. We're gonna tie it to this wood slat mount, which is, I guess, the most difficult part of this project, but it really isn't that difficult whatsoever. In fact, I find mounting plants to these wood slats to be much easier than mounting them to any other type of wooden material that I mount things to. So I'm going to be tying my orchid right around here. Let's just take the tiniest little sweet little bundle of sphagnum moss. Tell it it's sweet, you're so sweet. Press it down ever so lightly, and we're going to take our orchid and we're going to lay it down on top of that moss. This is going to be where it lives. We're going to try to maneuver some sphagnum moss in between the orchid roots. What we are going for is essentially just like a small little pod of sphagnum moss, keeping our orchid's roots happy and also going to help keep our orchid attached to the board. If you were lucky enough and your orchid was already planted in sphagnum moss inside its little tiny little nursery planter, then you can just add a little bit of moss on the base of the board and maybe just the tiniest little bit over top of the roots just to give it some fresh moss. But as you can kind of see here, and perhaps you can see with the one I made before, although this one did not have as robust of a root system as the one I'm working with today, that I tried to keep the roots for the most part on the outside because I think it also gives a really nice visual effect. Should have mentioned my sphagnum moss is pre-moistened, so I soak the moss and then I squeeze it out completely, so it's just a little damp, a little bit more than damp, I would say. Not quite moist, but not damp. Less than moist, more than damp. Also, before I get too far ahead, I have a couple of these roots here that you will see are a little brown and dried up. I'm just going to use my pruning shears to prune them back to where those roots are healthy. So now that we have our orchid placed roughly where we want it to be, it might move around a tiny bit in this process. We're going to get our fishing line right here, and we're going to get a couple feet, like 6 to 10 feet. You know, it depends on how much you think you're going to be tying this thing and securing it down to the board. These small orchids aren't going to require nearly as much as a full-size fern, for example. So our fishing line is separate from the roll, and I'm going to just feed it underneath right at the base of our mount, or where our mount is going to be. Let's tie it tight, at least double knot it. The finer the fishing line, the easier it is to tighten. Remove this extra bit, it'll fly away. And then even though the fishing line is clear, let's just hide it. So let's push it as far underneath our orchid that we can so we just don't see it anymore. And now, very similar to any other mounted plant, if you've done that before with the fishing line or any similar type of fastener, we are going to start to wrap it around the plant and fasten it in place. The part that might require a little bit extra care is I like to take care to not go over the orchid roots and just over the moss, which might take a little extra time because you gotta feed the fishing line through the gaps in the roots like I'm doing right now, but I think it will pay off with a much cleaner looking product and also keep our roots from being possibly smothered or suffocated from our fishing line. So I've gone from the bottom right corner and now I've pulled it all the way through to the top left, and I'm gonna stick it through, so I'm pulling it behind, which is also why I'm a really big fan of these wood slat mounts. It's so easy to tie stuff because there's so many spaces versus like the cork bark I used to work with, which if I had a really awkward spot, I'd have to like drill a hole like behind the moss to feed the fishing line through, which was just never easy. And our orchid's moving a tiny bit, but that's okay. Once we start to get it fastened, we can really get it into a spot that we see fit. So I'm gonna pull it tight, and I'm pulling pretty tight. Like I said, if those roots were covered up, they could get damaged here. So I would be really mindful there. And from here, you can just start to work your way around the orchid in whichever way you think is going to keep your orchid the most fastened to your wood board. So I'm just going back down to the bottom. I'm gonna pull it through. This is going to be the most difficult part when your orchid is the loosest, but once you get a couple ties around, it's going to be pretty well fastened. So now I'm at the bottom left, and I'm gonna work my way through, probably thread my fishing line through the roots once again, up to the top right. Thread it on through, and then once again, I'm just gonna pull it through the gap in the wood slat so that we are once again hanging out with our fishing line in the back. And now that we have those two, our orchid is much more secure. If I lean it forward, it's not just gonna fall over, which it would have done prior, but there would still be a lot of spaces for that moss to fall through as we're watering it. So we wanna at least go around with the fishing line at least like 4 more times, I would say. Really, you can use your best judgment, but at least 5 times is good to keep it in place. But I'll usually find myself going around probably 5 to 10 times with a plant this size. And maybe try to hit a few different angles in particular when you are working your way around. So for this 3rd time, I'm starting in the bottom center, and I'm gonna try to work my way as cleanly up through the center of this plant so it has some really nice central control. ask me if that is the right phrase that I need there. And then I'm just going to, once again, thread this through the roots so that we don't damage them. Pull it through. And we have our orchid in place. Being sure to hold your fishing line tightly throughout this whole project so that it doesn't loosen up in any spot. This is obviously easier said than done with an extra pair of hands. If you have someone to help you, good on you, but I am home alone today. I'm gonna go right back down to the bottom again, and I went up the left side on the center, so I'm just going to stay with what I did before, thread it on up through the right side of my orchid. And from here, since I've been focusing on going mostly upwards or vertical, let's do a couple that are horizontal just to once again keep things in as many places as possible. So I'm probably gonna work my way over horizontally twice, once in the middle, once closer to the bottom, just to keep anything from falling out from below. Threading it through once again to avoid damaging these delicate roots. It's okay if a couple of roots get a little suffocated or damaged, by the way, especially if you pick a plant like this one that has a really healthy, robust root system. The other one I showed you might have a couple less chances when it comes to that. I'm working my way across the bottom here, pulling it through to the back. So now we're gonna have to tie this to fasten it completely to the board. So just to make that easier, since I'm having the wood slats in this specific project run horizontally, which is going to be the easiest way to display air plants, obviously, so that they don't just slide down to the bottom, I'm going to pull it up vertically once again, just so that it's easier just to tie around the board. And we're gonna tie it the exact same way that we tied it at the beginning, where we just wrapped the fishing line around one of these wood slats and just fastened it to the board by just simply tying it like we would tie our shoes in a way, if we were tying them really tightly. All right, so I have just pulled this through the back, and we're just going to wrap it around once more. Oh my gosh, this is so hard to do by myself. I apologize. So I'm pulling it through. I could even take my scissors and remove some of this fishing line just to make it much easier on me, because did I even cut that? I don't think I actually cut that. Okay, there we go. Be gone, you. Then we're gonna pull it back through. And I'm just gonna work my way under these two little pieces of fishing line here. One of them is the one that I originally wrapped around. I just don't feel like fighting that battle right now. And tie a knot, pull it really tight. Then let's once again stick the fishing line back through those lines that we just tied it to once again. And we're gonna knot it again. Double knot's always good. With this 30-pound fishing line, I usually feel a little more comfortable doing a triple knot, just because it will become undone much easier than the finer fishing line. So double knot's fine. Don't have to do my triple knot I'm doing here. I am just being very anal about this. Anyway, we have our mess of fishing line back here. We can take our scissors, cut close, flip it around, and we have our orchid mounted to our wood board. That was so easy. You can use your scissors if you want to clean up any little bits of moss that you're not happy with. Of course, be careful of the roots. You can very easily damage them, or you can just kind of stuff it in. I don't really love the way it looks when it's kind of like sticking out the bottom here, so I will probably come on through with my scissors and trim it up a little bit, just so that you can really have that space there. There we go. And I didn't have any sheet moss on hand. If you're not obsessed with the look of this sphagnum moss, I totally get that. You can use some decorative sheet moss to cover up this moss, make it look much more appealing aesthetically if that's more your vibe. I don't really mind the natural look. It's what you're gonna see with orchids growing with anyway, so it appeals to me, but if that's not your vibe, I totally understand. This orchid's got a little bit more character. It's kind of going off to the side to have it flat. Do you see how I like it to be like flat up against the wood like that? Just like how I have this one here. These flowers just look much better with the way that we set this up. So maybe just really keep in mind the way that the flowers are pointing when you're picking out your orchids at the store. I clearly did not think that far ahead in advance. Okay, so we have our orchids tied up beautifully to these wooden mounts. We already had the air plants in this one, but I just took them out when I was getting things ready, so we can just pop a couple air plants back in both of these just to give the general appeal. What kind of air plants do I have? That is a great question, fabulous question. This is an Ionantha, Tillandsia Ionantha. All these are Tillandsia. This is a Tillandsia brachycaulis Schedina. Love it. And I forget what these are. They didn't come with a tag. Giving like orchids roots, which is why I picked them. I thought they would look really fun, particularly with the orchid roots. However, you probably could pick a more air plant and just add a lot more juxtaposition to our little art project here. Even some Spanish moss, like some live Spanish moss, could kind of be like strung around, and obviously you have to keep up with watering it. But if you have to water these like every 5 to 7 days because they're gonna dry out very quickly, it'll be pretty easy to do. And if the air plants are already in here, ready to go, then it'll just be very easy to keep up with watering them, not anything to be concerned about. So as you saw earlier at the beginning of this video when I first had the air plants in there, my thought process is, and as I was kind of explaining as well, is that the orchid is hanging out near the bottom right or the bottom left of the frame, and then you can use the rest of the frame to stage your air plants. So I really like the idea. These are probably gonna look like exactly the same, by the way, because they literally have like these same air plants for both of them, because that's just what they had at the store. Just sticking a little air plant in a little spot. You can stick one down the bottom because there's nothing really going on down here, because there's all this space right here from keeping it clean with the bottom of the orchid. And this is where you can get really creative. Like I said, you could technically not even do the orchid. I think these wooden slat mounts would be amazing ways to display air plants on your wall, especially if you have a bunch of pictures hanging up already, framed photos, and this would just fit seamlessly, in my own opinion. With my aesthetic that I have in my home, I'm imagining this in a modern home, not fitting as seamlessly, but still, I think it's such a fun little project. Also something that could be really fun to do with kids, or even if you're having like a couple of friends over, you want to do a craft, just get a couple of these wooden slat mounts, go to your local grocery store, get a couple of these cheap orchids, grab a handful of air plants from your local plant store, and you have a really fun project for a little birthday or activity, or I don't know. I think it's so fun. I also have this little Ionantha here. Shove it wherever. I don't know. I guess that looks kind of messy. I think I'm more down with the air plants and the orchids being on separate sides, just like for my own aesthetics and how I like things. I don't know, even though this orchid could even just like join this one down here and just be like, or I'm sorry, air plants, not orchid. Just like air plant party in the bottom right. I don't know, it's so fun, it's so cool, it's different. And this is very much a template. Like I said, this is the beta version, not the alpha version. So I would love to hear and even see if you want to tag me on Instagram with any of your creations if you make something similar to this. What you do with this is just the bare bones version, like I said, a template for you to work upon to make some really fun projects with a really fun, interesting piece of gardening equipment that I don't really see used like ever. I think the most important thing that you really have to keep in mind with these is just like any other mounted plant or any other plant in general, that you need to put this somewhere where it's going to be receiving enough sunlight. So these orchids are going to prefer being within like 6 feet of a bright window, even like right inside the windowsill is fantastic, right off of the windowsill. You could hang it in between 2 windows if you have like a little bit of drywall space in between 2 windows. I've had that in plenty of my spaces and this would fit perfectly in there. If you do put it somewhere where it's not receiving a lot of sunlight, it's still going to look beautiful. You just might find yourself replacing the orchid and the air plants more often than you would like. The orchid will stop blooming in a couple of weeks or a couple of months depending on how fresh these blooms are, and they will rebloom over time as long as they are properly taken care of. And it is so joyous when your little leafless orchid spits out a flower stalk or 2. It really just makes you feel so good. Flowers have such a great impact on the home. I forget that. Me just bringing in these 2 orchids into my home after going to the grocery store the other day was like, wow, I need more orchids in my home now. So that's today's project, this gorgeous wall-mounted orchid art piece. I think that's my best description that I have for it. Let me know a better description if you have one. I think this is such a fun project. So many different directions to go. I obviously just went in 2 very similar directions, but one direction, literally the same exact thing, just put in a mirror. But I'm happy with it. Also, I don't know if it's really worth mentioning, but I'm going to, I think I might have planted these on the back side of these wood slat mounts because I prefer the way they look on the back, if it is the back. The other side has just like some metal coils, not really a difference changer. Might add a little bit more character and uniqueness if you want to display those. I think it will actually look pretty cool. That is an aesthetic choice I am going to leave up to you. But thank you so much for joining me in today's video. Also, thank you to repotme.com for sponsoring this series. As I mentioned, I'll leave any of the products that I use from repotme.com linked in the description below. And if you click through any of those links and make any purchases through those links, I will get a commission. So thank you again. If you don't already, you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at phillyfoliage. Subscribe to my Patreon for even more houseplant content. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.